So one of my favorite couches that I used to fall asleep on was at my paternal grandparents' very small house on Cherry Street. And this is where I first learned how to slow down long enough to tune into the senses of my soul. My grandparents' Colorado was very different from the one that I grew up in. I grew up in a quiet, eerily clean suburb southeast of Denver, and my grandparents, both of a Mexican immigrant background, lived in an industrial corner of North Denver, where there was this mix of odors from oil refineries, pet food factories, and exhaust fumes that plagued and polluted the air. On the drive to my grandparents' house, I would hold my breath and plug my nose. But once inside their modest home, I could finally exhale. And on the inhale in their beautiful home, my nose would be greeted with these beautiful warm scents. Perfectly charred tortillas, the smell of sweet, sweet cinnamon from freshly brewed canela tea. Siéntate, come, eat, my grandmother V would say. And we'd all sit at the table and enjoy a slow meal with the faint sound of Telemundo playing in the background. And any talk of school or work demands were quickly hushed, because going to my grandparents' house was about one thing: rest. And in time, we would shuffle over from the kitchen table down to the living room, and I would get to lie down on this plastic-covered green sofa. And I would curl up onto my grandmother's lap. My Grandma V had these immaculately kept, bright red, perfectly manicured nails. And with them, she would scratch my head and rub my back and sing a nursery rhyme. Sana, sana, colita de rana, si no sana hoy, sanará mañana, until eventually I would fall asleep. I didn't know any Spanish, so I had no idea what she was saying to me, but it didn't matter, because it was all about rest, which wasn't about time for making meaning out of things. It was more about sense-making. It didn't actually matter what the words of that nursery rhyme meant. What mattered is how those words and her love made me feel. Calm, present, safe, restored, with this deep, deep sense of being enough, just as I was right there in my grandmother's arms. But away from that little house on Cherry Street, that sacred downtime, that got gobbled up and almost completely forgotten by me, because I was socialized to compulsively do more and even peg my identity to my productivity. My worth became tied to my work, and I found myself that I was a human doing, almost forgetting that I am a human being. There have been so many times in my life when I have been depleted, running on fumes. My neck and shoulder muscles speak the loudest, wound up in these tight, tight knots. And it's in these times that I find myself in need of a compassionate intervention, one that doesn't shame my weary exhaustion as a personal failing. And I do not want any form of shallow relief. I was on a search. What does it mean to really rest? That's when I found someone who's known as the nap bishop, and she was spreading the good word. Artist and theologian Tricia Hersey is the founder of the nap ministry, and she helped me understand how rest is not only an opportunity for respite and renewal, but it's actually something that is so necessary to reconfigure ourselves towards liberation. In her book, Rest is Resistant, a manifesto, Tricia Hersey shares that rest saved her life. She weaves with personal storytelling, Black liberation, womanism, and embodied semantic work an entire rest is resistance framework. Tricia's own rest resurrection started as this desperate attempt to get relief from exhaustion, which sounded oh so very familiar to me. And it caught my attention when, as a child, she recalls watching her grandmother, Aura, sit on a plastic-covered yellow couch, resting her eyes for a few minutes a day. Her grandma Aura's daily commitment to just be was one of Hersey's first examples of just how powerful rest can be. And Hersey goes on to name the ways that rest is a form of resistance. And that is because, beloveds, we are living in a time of pervasive grind culture, of mass exhaustion and major burnout. And this life-limiting and even deadly, unsustainable pace of working, it is all a byproduct of very oppressive systems that are constantly working to keep our bodies and spirits hostage for making one thing: profit. Hersey traces grind culture back to an ideology that was present on slave plantations, where her ancestors' bodies were commodified, dehumanized, and brutalized as tools for accumulating wealth. And today it is these very same systems of capitalism, ageism, ableism, and patriarchy and white supremacy that are continuing to manipulate and socialize us to stay exhausted, as a vicious cycle of intergenerational and collective trauma. Even our own planet is exhausted from being constantly toiled and tortured. Slowing down and resting provides us all with an opportunity to interrupt this cycle. Because rest is resistance comes from a Black liberation theology lens, it is rooted in this understanding that no one is free until all of us are free, which is a holy knowing that we UUs know deep in our bones. We know that we are interconnected and that we live in an interdependent web. And Hersey suspects that while the legacy of exhaustion resides in all of our bodies, it especially lives in the bodies of those with melanated skin, those who are descendants of plantation labor and other marginalized people. Connecting that it was likely my grandmother's Mexican immigrant background that taught her to value rest was very humbling for me. My grandmother knew, like Tricia Hersey's grandmother knew, that when we ignore and deny our body's need for rest, we also lose touch with our center, with our source, with our spirit, which, beloveds, we so very much need if we are going to imagine and create alternative worlds of justice and liberation. So a sacred pause, making time for rest, it is not only an embodied commitment to end harmful legacies of exhaustion, it's also an opportunity to begin anew, to tap back into our deepest selves, into our inherent worth and dignity, which some of us may call divinity, that is our very birthright. And Hersey emphasizes that rest is not a privilege, and it is not a luxury only available to a few select folks, that's not actually true. Rest is a necessity for each and every single one of us, because our bodies are our own, no matter what oppressive systems have taught us. So we are called to deprogram the violent messaging that our bodies belong to a system and are only worthy when they are producing or doing. Rest is so subversive, beloveds, because it insists that I am worthy now, that you are worthy now. My personal rest portal had us traveling back to a time in my own family tree to reclaim some ancestral wisdom. And now I want to take us deeper and even further back in time to a place in our faith family tree. Some of you may know that Transylvanian Unitarianism is a predecessor to our liberal Unitarian Church of the modern era. It is the first U in our UU. And the Protestant Reformation arrived in Transylvania early in the 16th century. And within Unitarianism, there was a Sabbatarian movement that started to emerge in the late 16th century. The Sabbatarians were Unitarians who practiced the Sabbath, a day of religious observance to rest from any labor, fusing Christian and Jewish religious rituals together. Theologically, the Sabbatarians, they stressed the absolute unity of God and the humanity of Jesus as the promised Messiah, but it was actually their observance of the Sabbath, a day of rest, that was the center of their faith. So where do these concepts of Sabbath keeping even come from? Sabbath rest has two formulations in the Hebrew Bible. One is linked to creation, and the other to the Exodus out of Egypt. Rabbi Abraham Herschel says that the first holy thing in all creation was not a people or a place, but a day. In Scripture, God made everything in creation and called it good, but when God rested on the seventh day, God called it holy. And in Exodus, the Israelites were forced to work around the clock for Pharaoh, who didn't care if they died of exhaustion. It was the Israelites' commitment to rest that was a radical act of resistance in saying no. No to anything that tried to bind them from being free. So as devout studiers of the Holy Scriptures, our Sabbatarian ancestors took very seriously a weekly day of rest. And I like to think of them as the Sabbath keepers in our Unitarian family tree. And our Sabbatarian ancestors knew very intimately what it meant to be a people of resistance. Because after they started to grow in size, they became one of the largest religions in Transylvania. And they suffered two severe persecutions in the years 1618 and 1638. Their charge, you ask? Propagating the validity of the Torah among Christians. So, as part of an effort to suppress their growing movement, laws were enacted, making Sabbatarianism outlawed. And unfortunately, and tragically, our own Unitarian churches distanced themselves, formally declaring Sabbatarians were not proper members, forever excluding them from fellowship. Our Sabbatarian ancestors were imprisoned, their homes and houses of prayer demolished. Some of them converted to Christianity to avoid severe punishment. Others fled to the mountains. For almost 4 centuries, the Sabbatarians experienced fierce persecution, but during that time, the flame of their faith was unable to be extinguished. For it is believed that most of them kept their Sabbath-keeping practices in secret for another 2.5 centuries before eventually, across generations, converting more fully and formally into Judaism. As you use in our space, I suspect that we rekindle the flame of our Sabbatarian ancestors when we take time to center rest and healing for our collective liberation. So today, I honor my grandmother's memory, and I also honor the Sabbatarians in our faith family tree by trying to take a day of deliberate rest, a weekly Sabbath-keeping practice. But I must warn you, rest, which Tricia Hersey calls a meticulous love practice, is not so easy. Because the thing is, the more I commit to creating my own Sabbath-keeping practices, the more I discover that, sure, sometimes I feel that way that I described on my grandmother's lap. Sometimes I'm calm, safe, restored, but more often than not, I also feel anxiety, guilt, shame, grief, pain. These are spells of what Episcopal priest Reverend Barbara Brown Taylor calls a Sabbath sickness. Tricia Hersey describes this unsettling feeling that rises up just when we start to slow down as the unraveling and undoing of trauma in our bodies. Rest. Rest is an embodied work of refusal. And taking rest is disruptive and so countercultural that I believe it is one of the most risky spiritual practices that we can do. So here's the thing, we can start small, beloveds. When and where can you find a moment of rest just for today? Finding rest can be sky gazing, closing your eyes for 60 seconds, daydreaming while looking out the window, eating a mindful meal, saying a prayer, taking time away from technology, crocheting and coloring and laughing intensely. And it can also be listening to music. Earlier I shared that psalm for my Grandma V, the Sana Sana Colita de Lana rhyme that would wind me down. And it has become a personal lullaby for me, a lullaby of rest. And I only very recently decided I should probably look up what it's saying. So its English translation, here it is. It's heal, heal little tail of the frog. If you don't heal today, you'll heal tomorrow. A gentle reminder from my Grandma V that disrupting this grind culture, it is a slow, lifelong process that we will learn again and again. And I now have another psalm to my Rest as Resistance playlist. It happens to be a chant from my largest family, my UU family, each and every single one of you. And we sing it from time to time. I like to imagine that this psalm we sing is a form of mysterious ritual, one where we can commune with and honor our Sabbatarian ancestors of Transylvania. So sing with me and imagine that maybe, just maybe, if we listen deep enough, we can hear their voices enchanting us to return, return again, return to the home of our soul.